Sleepless, I watch the heavens turn, propelled by the motions of the spheres. Those stars spell out, I don't know how, the weal and woe of future years. If I flew up to the starry vault and joined the heavens' westward flow, I would learn, as I traveled the sky, the fate of all things here below. The Caliph Al-Mamun.
For the faithful, the teachings of the Prophet tell of 5 pillars that must be practiced. The first of these, of course, is the profession of Islam as the one true faith. The second is the command to pray to Allah, acknowledging that He alone is supreme in all creation. This prayer is to be done 5 times per day, once before sunrise, once just after the sun has passed its highest point, once in the evening before the sun is set, again in the evening after the sun has set, and finally, once at night. For each of these times of prayer, the adherent is to stop, wash themselves in a holy act of purification, and face towards the holy site of Mecca. It is in this act that one finds much of the impetus for the importance of astronomy among those who follow the dictates of Islam. Like Judaism and Christianity, the time of prayer is to be established so that the community prays together, no matter where they may be. The reliable determination of noon, the time when the sun is due south and highest in the sky, was essential in order that the call to prayer be made appropriately. More than this, though, was the necessity to face not a specific cardinal direction, as was the case with Christian churches in their orientation along an east-west axis, but instead to face towards a geographical location. This directive to face Mecca required that each settlement, city, or camp be able to determine its place on the globe so that the correct orientation could be achieved. Such a determination required an excellent understanding of geography and astronomy, as well as precise measurements. The astronomer had to be able to establish both the latitude and longitude of the place of prayer, know the latitude and longitude of Mecca, and then apply the rules of spherical trigonometry to ascertain which way a mosque should face or a petitioner should prostrate. In each mosque, then, was an individual, the muwaqwit, tasked with the holy work of establishing these things. Such a task is not trivial, and it presented an enormous challenge as the first Arabic rulers of the rising Islamic Empire attempted to put in place the commandments of Muhammad. However, beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries, and continuing long after the empire fractured, astronomers and mathematicians labored first to understand and translate the works of the Persians, Indians, and Greeks, and then to extend and improve them. Over the course of 700 years, this tradition, begun in Baghdad, continued across North Africa, and then transmitted first to Spain and then Europe, would preserve and expand both astronomical and astrological knowledge. On this leg of our voyage, we travel across space and time, from the halls of Alexandria to the streets of Baghdad, and from the deserts of Syria to the centers of learning in Al-Andalus. In this episode, we will follow the development of Islamic astronomy from inception to the cusp of the European Renaissance, and in doing so, see the vital role it played as humanity continued to strive to find its place in the cosmos.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results
of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 9, Islamic Astronomy. Before we begin this week's narrative, I should begin with a very important caveat. While there is much agreement in the historical and scientific community as to the nature and importance of the work we will be discussing, the same can't quite be said to be true for what this period should be called. Some advocate for the term Arabic astronomy or the broader Arabic science. This is based on the fact that the political entities dominant in the early times and early regions we'll be discussing were predominantly ruled by Arab leaders and families. Others, however, point out that while this was certainly true for the regions of the Arabian Peninsula from the late 6th century through the 12th century, much of the structure of the empire was administered by Persian families for that period, and as the empire expanded and then later fragmented, other ethnic groups came to hold and wield a great deal of political power, even after the Mongol conquest of much of the heart of the empire in the 13th century. Another set of scholars suggest that due to the fragmented political picture throughout much of the broad historical time period, the focus should be on the common cultural aspects that unified the period, most notably the rise and spread of Islam. This, however, neglects the reality that many of those who took part in the work throughout the 7 or so centuries we'll be discussing were not, in fact, Islamic. Early on, there were many Zoroastrians involved in the work, as well as a number of Christians, Jews, and even Hindus. These commentators suggest that to label the period based on a single religious perspective is to neglect, marginalize, and exclude the work done by adherents to other religious traditions. It is, as they say, a sticky wicket. Any title or term, no matter how well-intentioned, will neglect the contributions of one or more groups in the large, politically and culturally diverse region and time we will be discussing. So while I have chosen to refer to this period as that of Islamic astronomy, a decision I hope to justify here in a moment, please understand, as is usually the case with great intellectual movements, the individuals who participate in this endeavor are not some sort of monolithic block. There were Arabs and Persians, Greeks and Hebrews, Indians, Africans and Europeans, Muslims and Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, and even atheists who were all drawn to the emerging intellectual explosion that would take place first in Baghdad and then spread through the parts of the world touched by the expanding political structure of the empire. The fundamental reason I have decided to call the episode Islamic astronomy rather than Arabic astronomy is because I have become convinced that the driving impetus behind the development of the subject, with its accompanying tools and techniques, is rooted in the needs of the religious culture. While the broader historical development encompasses a complex interplay of political ambitions, religious imperatives, and superstitious beliefs, the practice of astronomy is moved forward almost exclusively by cultural forces associated, at least initially, with the demands made by the religious requirements of Islam as discussed in the episode's introduction. It is only later that political prestige and astrological divination become factors. Also, due to the limits of length and scope for this podcast, we don't have time to go into any sort of detailed history on the rise of an Islamic/Arabic empire at this time, other than to say that by 750 CE, under the impetus of the Umayyad dynasty, it spanned from the borders of India in the east, across Persia and the Arabian Peninsula, through North Africa to Spain, and the Atlantic Ocean in the west. During this time, there were the first efforts to bring to the fledgling empire the great books of the civilizations with which the Arab people interacted, first of the Persians, then of the Indians and the Greeks. From this later source were acquired the first copies of Ptolemy's Almagest, likely in 735 CE or so. This would have been translated initially into Syriac and later into Arabic. In 750, the Umayyad dynasty was overthrown by the Abbasids, who would move the capital first to Damascus and then to Kufa and finally to a site on the Tigris River. At this site would be built the city of Baghdad, near a collection of trading outposts and villages. Over the next 50 years, the caliphs of this line would work to stabilize the dynasty's control of the empire through policies of cultural inclusion and religious toleration. There are three figures that stand out in the line of rulers: Al-Mansur, Al-Rashid, and Al-Mamun. Under the supervision of Al-Mansur, there began a robust translation movement, including works on astronomy. Of these, the earliest dated to about 770 CE, and it was likely a collection of Indian star charts known as Zij al-Sindhind. Also, there was a collection of Persian astronomical tables detailing the rising and setting of various stars that likely connected back to the work of ancient Mesopotamian scholars. This was continued and expanded under the rule of Al-Rashid, who began the process of encouraging scholarly commentary on the works being translated. The third figure, Al-Mamun, is the most important of the three with regards to our narrative here. He embraced an idea known as Mu'tazilism, which was sort of a rationalist philosophy that opposed a strongly literalist interpretation of the Quran. From this, Al-Mamun developed the belief that bringing together thinkers and scholars from across the caliphate was beneficial. He sought to integrate all of the newly translated knowledge from various cultures around him with the teachings of Islam to create a coherent worldview that didn't have to reject the hard-won understanding of those who had come before. It is Al-Mamun who is said to have created one of the greatest centers of knowledge and learning in human history, with the establishment of Baghdad's Bayt al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom. As is the case with the Library of Alexandria, there are a number of questions regarding the size and scope of the institution. There are a number of contemporary scholars who suggest that it was little more than Al-Mamun's palace library and a small group of associated scholars. However, if we are to take the reports of the Library of Alexandria seriously, it seems that we should do the same with this particular institution. What does seem likely is that the House of Wisdom may have grown out of earlier royal collections, especially given that a robust textual translation movement was already underway by the time of Al-Mamun's ascension to the throne. Additionally, due to the widespread nature of the patronage among noble families of the empire, particularly those in Baghdad, it is likely that the scholarly and intellectual work may have been spread out at a number of multiple locations throughout the city. So much so, in fact, that Baghdad was often called the City of Wisdom. Nevertheless, it does seem clear that the specific institution known as the House of Wisdom served as the central point and focus of the larger community, if for no other reason that it was the primary recipient of the patronage of the Caliph. This support was a result of a deeply held belief in the words of the Prophet that, quote, "The ink of a scholar is more holy than the blood of a martyr," unquote. One of the innovations that would have spurred on the work in Baghdad was the acquisition of the technology of paper from the Chinese. This would have allowed translators to move from working with less durable papyrus that had to be kept in scroll form to creating books that were cheaper and lighter weight than the codices or books that had previously been made from bark or animal hides. Additionally, Al-Mamun expanded the role of the institution from being merely a center of translation to one where new thought was not only encouraged but expected. In other words, a true research institute. One of the most influential figures early in this expanded role was the philosopher Al-Kindi. His work in making compatible the writings of Aristotle and the Quran was essential to the process of integration. As Jim al-Khalili says in his book, House of Wisdom, quote, he, meaning Al-Kindi, is most famous for being the first to introduce the philosophy of Aristotle to the Arabic-speaking world, making it both accessible and acceptable to a Muslim audience. Central to Al-Kindi's work was the way his writing fused Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic theology, thereby creating an intellectual platform for a debate between philosophers and theologians that would run for 400 years. Unquote. It should be noted here that this work would have included both Aristotle's terrestrial and celestial physics, something central to the study of astronomy and the continued development of cosmology going forward. It was as a result of the patronage of al-Mamun that one of the most remarkable figures in the entire Islamic Golden Age came to Baghdad. His name was al-Khwarizmi, and while best known for his work in mathematics, having helped bring Hindu numbers to Baghdad and developing a new mathematical discipline in his book Kitab al-Jabir, al-Khwarizmi also did extensive work in the field of astronomy. So important were his contributions in many fields of science that historian of science George Sarton has called the half century from 800 to 850 CE the time of al-Khwarizmi. By 825, various systems to predict the motions of stars and planets could be found in use in the Abbasid Caliphate. Some astronomers were using the methods developed by Indian astronomers, others the ancient Mesopotamian tables, and a few the methods detailed in two of Ptolemy's works, the Almagest, and the shorter and easier to use handy tables. Each of these sources came with its own sort of methodology and cosmology that often disagreed with the others both qualitatively and quantitatively. Al-Mamun found this divergence just absolutely unacceptable, and so sought to establish which was the most accurate. Fortunately, as Islamic science was metaphorically rebooting natural philosophy, there were many new eyes willing to look to the sources with little previous investment and bias. Because of this, various ideologies and presuppositions could be set aside, and one of the things that the scholarly community realized was that some of the issues could be resolved with better measurements. Recall that the last set of serious measurements had been made between, say, 100 and 200 CE, over 6 centuries earlier. To address this deficit of data, al-Mamun did something that may never have been done before. He ordered the establishment of the first state-sponsored large-scale scientific project, complete with a state-of-the-art scientific facility, the Momtahan Observatory in the Al-Shamsiyya district of Baghdad. Likely equipped with a brass gnomon, several astrolabes, and a mural quadrant, the research team was led by the young astronomer Sanad ibn Ali Yahudi and his older mentor Al-Abbas al-Jahari. These two assembled a team that included al-Khwarizmi, Yahya ibn Abi Mansur, and a less regarded astronomer who would have an enormous impact on Western civilization, al-Farghani. It would be al-Farghani who would compose a compendium of Ptolemy's Alchemist that would survive long enough to be translated to Europe and influence generations of astronomers and navigators there, including a certain Portuguese entrepreneur looking for funding from the Spanish royal family. On this particular project, however, he was likely tasked with overseeing the construction, use, and maintenance of the equipment at the observatory. From 828 to 829 CE, the main objective of the newly constructed facility was to check the observations of Ptolemy to see if they could, in fact, be trusted. A number of measurements of the motions of the sun and moon were made, along with an establishing of the longitude and latitude coordinates of 24 stars. In order to double-check the veracity of these measurements, a second observatory was built at the Deir Muran monastery overlooking Damascus. These observations established the supremacy of Ptolemy's measurements over the others and were published in a set of star tables known as the verified tables. It should be noted, however, that even as the Ptolemaic system was accepted into Islamic science, it was held that it was subject to questioning and refinement, both numerical and astronomical. In fact, when al-Farghani publishes his compendium in 850, it is clear that he updates a number of Ptolemy's parameters, such as the tilt of the ecliptic to the celestial equator, also called the obliquity, and the circumference of the Earth. Additionally, he recognized that the apogee positions of the sun and moon, i.e., the points where the two bodies are furthest away from the Earth, move at a rate somewhat different than what Ptolemy thought. The other project that al-Mamun undertook at this time was to determine the true length of a degree on the surface of the Earth. This was of vital importance for a couple of reasons. The first is that it would give a way to determine how far north and south, or east and west, a settlement would be from Mecca, thus establishing the proper direction of prayer. The second is that it would establish the size of the Earth. As we mentioned in the Rounding the Earth episode, there were disagreements as to the length of a degree and the size of the spherical Earth, and Al-Mamun set out to resolve those. His attempts involved sending out parties to measure the altitude of several stars at some given geographical point, and then have two teams walk in opposite directions north and south until they measured the altitudes of the stars changed by half a degree, either higher or lower in the sky. They would then pace that distance back to the original starting point and thus arrive at a number. Unfortunately, when this was done at two different locations, Mosul and Palmyra, the numbers were far enough apart, about 20% by the way, that they only added to the confusion. The issue would only be resolved when the circumference was determined by measuring the height of a mountain over the flat plains of Central Asia by al-Biruni in the 11th century. With all of this data, Al-Mamun was able to direct his scholars to undertake the creation of the world's most accurate map, eclipsing that of Ptolemy's Geographica. This map would include all the great cities of the Caliphate, thus extending the known world. It also more correctly estimated the size of the Mediterranean and showed both the Indian and Atlantic Oceans as open or unbounded by land on one or more sides. In some ways, this extension of the map and thus the known world may have been the greatest and most innovative achievement of all of the work Al-Mamun sponsored through the House of Wisdom.
A stubborn critic would say, "What is the benefit of these sciences? He does not know the virtue that distinguishes mankind from all the animals. It is knowledge, in general, which is pursued solely by man, and which is pursued for the sake of knowledge itself, because its acquisition is truly delightful, and is unlike the pleasures desirable from other pursuits. For the good cannot be brought forth, and evil cannot be avoided, except by knowledge. What benefit then is more vivid? What use is more abundant?" Al-Biruni.
In the period following Al-Mamun's death in 833, work continued in astronomy along much the same vein that we've already discussed. Perhaps the best known astronomical figure during this time was al-Battani, the greatest observational astronomer of the Islamic Golden Age. He continued the observing program of the two observatories and extended al-Farghani's corrections to Ptolemy. Moreover, he established the length of the solar year to within an error of just 2 minutes and 22 seconds. So excellent were his methods and his observations that it would be cited in the work of Copernicus some 23 times. He also corrected Ptolemy's inaccurate rate of precession to a value of 1 degree every 66 years and rejected an idea known as trepidation. Trepidation is an idea that says that the precession of the equinoxes was not a uniform process, but rather one that oscillated back and forth. Put forward by a fellow astronomer, Ibn Qura, based on what turned out to be an inaccurate set of observations that seemed to show the rate of precession slowing down. The idea was that the equinoxes would first move in one direction along the celestial equator, and then slow down, reverse direction, and then travel back the other way until they slowed in reverse direction again. In this way, the equinoxes were said to oscillate back and forth over the centuries. Al-Battani felt that the data that supported this model was likely in error, and so, correctly, he rejected the explanation. His careful measurements, however, did show that the tilt of the ecliptic with the celestial equator was changing very slightly over time, a motion we now know to be true. During this time, there is another thread of inquiry that is really quite fascinating that merits some additional discussion and investigation. As we've mentioned on occasion as we've worked through the Hellenistic astronomers, the geocentric model was not the only game in town. We saw that a moving Earth was part of a model of the Pythagoreans, and that Archimedes told of Aristarchus' heliocentric model. Plutarch writes of a Mesopotamian astronomer by the name of Seleucus, who is said to have quote-unquote proved a heliocentric model, though it is thought by most historians of astronomy that what is meant by this is that Seleucus likely had a model that could produce a table of values for the positions of various planets over time. Unfortunately, none of Seleucus' work survives, so we can't really know. However, when Hipparchus rejects this model, it seems to have been consigned to the intellectual backwaters. However, as part of a growing feeling that while the Almagest was a great work, it might have errors or at least limitations, there were Islamic astronomers who began to question the fundamental principle that the Earth was at the center of the cosmos. Whether that was due to having read the works of Aristarchus and Seleucus, the influence of Indian astronomers, or through their own considerations of the problem is unknown. But it is clear that there were a few who were willing to think about rearranging the universe. One such astronomer was a Persian by the name of al-Baqi. His model was a halfway sort of thing, partway between the geocentric model of Ptolemy and the heliocentric model of Aristarchus. He suggested that while the Earth was stationary at the center of the universe and the Sun revolved around it, the other planets revolved around the Sun. While it is uncertain whether al-Baqi thought that this was a physical description of the actual universe or merely a mathematical artifice that could be used to predict the motions of the stars and planets more precisely, we do know that his writings were translated into Latin prior to those of a full Aristotelian cosmology. It is also very interesting to note that when Tycho Brahe proposes his alternative to the Copernican heliocentric model in the late 1500s, it will bear more than a passing resemblance to the one put forward by al-Baqi. This willingness to question and improve on Ptolemy can best be seen in the work of our next two figures, al-Haytham and al-Biruni. Additionally, the skepticism would extend to encompass criticisms of Aristotle's physics as well. At this time, at the close of the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was falling apart. After the death of al-Mamun, a series of weaker and more conservative caliphs had taken the throne, only to see their empire fracture into semi-autonomous provinces that paid only the slightest homage to the person in Baghdad. This political instability would lead to a number of regional conflicts, especially at the edges of the former large Abbasid Caliphate, most notably in Central Asia and North Africa. The astronomer most associated with this continued questioning in the 11th century CE was a Persian by the name of Abu Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni. Born in 973 CE in modern-day Uzbekistan, al-Biruni was a polymath who spoke and wrote half a dozen languages and whose intellectual interests spanned subjects from natural sciences to history to linguistics. In addition to extensive work in physics, astronomy, and mathematics, he is known to have written a work that detailed the history of India and tenets of the Hindu faith. Al-Biruni was a humble but self-assured man who was devoted to scholarship. Often a rival to the more flamboyant and arrogant physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna in the West, al-Biruni engaged the younger scholar in a number of debates regarding Aristotle's assertions about the nature of the universe. He questioned the assumptions about celestial motion having to be circular, Aristotle's rejection of atomism, and whether the sun's rays had substance by which they transmitted heat. In addition, as I mentioned in the episode on rounding the Earth, it is likely al-Biruni was able to accurately measure the radius of the Earth by using the height of a mountain situated over a vast plain and some pretty nifty mathematics. In his writings on astronomy, which amount to some 95 books, he considered a number of really interesting issues, including an astrolabe built by an astronomer in Baghdad, al-Sidzi. This astrolabe was based on the idea that the Earth turned. Like almost all Islamic astronomers, al-Baqi notwithstanding, al-Biruni was an avowed geocentrist. Nevertheless, he found the astrolabe and its assumptions, the things that it was sort of based on, really interesting, and so thought to mention it in his writings. In commenting on it, he acknowledges that such a model would produce the same empirical observations as the geocentric model with the stationary Earth, and so recognizes that as an honest investigator, he would be unable to distinguish between the two pictures given the data that existed at the time. In this, we again see a somewhat instrumentalist leaning in those focused on developing descriptions of the physical world. This is not to say that al-Biruni didn't have a way he thought the universe was put together. It's very clear that he did, and that this belief likely guided the path of his investigations. But rather, this is to say that like many others in the history of the scientific endeavor, he had the intellectual honesty to recognize that if two different models both described a physical phenomenon equally well, either model had to be considered just as valid as the other based on evidence alone. This focus on the empirical evidence as the foundation of inquiry marks a fundamental turning point in the process of scientific inquiry, and it would be shared by many other Islamic astronomers and scientists of this time.
The seeker after truth is not one who studies the writings of the ancients and, following his natural disposition, puts his trust in them, but rather the one who suspects his faith in them and questions what he gathers from them, the one who submits to argument and demonstration and not the sayings of human beings whose nature is fraught with all kinds of imperfection and deficiency. Thus, the duty of the man who investigates the writings of the scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, and applying his mind to the core and margins of its content, attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. Ibn al-Haytham.
One figure who embraced the philosophical position of doubt and questioning was, at that time, working in a place far across the Islamic world from Central Asia. Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazan, as he is sometimes known in the West, was a man of Arab descent born in Basra who came into his own as the Abbasid Caliphate was falling apart. One of the most fractious of the breakaway regions was the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and the young ruler there brought al-Haytham to the Caliphate to work on a project. After a series of escapades, which, by the way, you can hear all about next week. How's that for a teaser? He settled down in Cairo, the capital of the Fatimids, which was styling itself as a rival to Baghdad by drawing on the connection to the ancient city of Alexandria just to the north, by establishing its own grand house of wisdom. It is here that he would do most of his work in solitude, work which has earned him the designation by some historians of science as the most important physicist in the period between Aristotle and Newton. His most influential work was in the area of optics, and he also made important contributions in mathematics. However, it is his work in astronomy and on science as a method of inquiry that we'll focus here. While al-Haytham agreed with Ptolemy's geocentric cosmology, he was less impressed with the mathematics the Alexandrian scholar had used to describe the motions of the planets. In response to this, he composed a work titled The Model of Motion for Each of the 7 Planets. In it, he proposed a new mathematical approach to the problem that parameterized the geometry in such a way that the specifics of the model of motion didn't much matter. In other words, he developed a mathematical framework to describe and predict the motions of the planets that didn't really rely on whether there were deferents and epicycles or eccentrics or equants. To him, it didn't matter how the motions were produced, but rather that the proper mathematical functions could be developed to account for them. These descriptions were cast in such a way that they were said to work for an earthbound observer regardless of the physical structure that might produce them. This is important because it meant that it didn't matter if the sun went around the earth or vice versa, something Al-Hatham himself acknowledges as a legitimate possibility, even if he himself didn't think that it was the case that the earth moved. To do this, he introduced an entirely new thing, something that he referred to as quote-unquote required time, or the time needed for a planet to trace an arc in the sky. By introducing this, he treats time in a way that a modern theoretical physicist would recognize as a parameter or variable in his mathematics. What is really fascinating is that in his formulation, Al-Hatham ends up treating time as a geometrical quantity rather than what physicists call an absolute invariant. The other great contribution Al-Hatham made, one introduced initially in the writings of an earlier scholar of medicine, Al-Razi, and reinforced in the writings of Al-Biruni, was that the study of the natural world was to take place according to specific criteria of empirical evidence. In this, the ideals of Al-Hatham predate the writings of either Roger or Francis Bacon by centuries, and should be understood to mark a foundational milestone in the development of scientific inquiry. In Al-Hatham's own words, quote, "We should distinguish the properties of particulars, and gather by induction what pertains to the eye, and what is found in the manner of sensation to be uniform, unchanging, manifest, and not subject to doubt. After which, we should ascend in our inquiry and reasoning, gradually and orderly, criticizing premises and exercising caution in regard to conclusions. Our aim in all that we make subject to inspection and review being to employ justice, not to follow prejudice, and to take care in all that we judge and criticize that we seek the truth and not be swayed by opinion." Unquote. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like the beginnings of science to me. It is at this point that our story travels west. When the Abbasids came to power in 750 CE, the dynasty they replaced, of course, was the Umayyad Caliphate, which had overseen the original expansion of the overall Islamic empire from the Arabian Peninsula to as far away as European Spain. When the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, they attempted to eliminate that entire family, but one young prince escaped their purge and fled across North Africa to the city of Cordoba in Spain. There he declared an independent emir or province, and after a period of civil war, overthrew the Abbasid governor and established an independent political base. In a process that very much mirrored that in Baghdad, though on a much longer time scale, these Umayyad rulers built up Cordoba physically and culturally until the city was said to rival both Baghdad and Cairo as the wealthiest and most beautiful among the Islamic caliphates. As part of this, a great center of learning was constructed, and scholars were enticed to join the community being created there. Unfortunately, the golden age of Islamic Spain was not to last as long as that of Baghdad due to political intrigue within and machinations of foreign powers without, first the Berbers of North Africa and then the Christian powers of Europe. Nevertheless, for a time, the community gathered there continued the work of Islamic scholars of the 10th and 11th centuries. This work was most prolific in the fields of medicine and philosophy, but there was an important contribution made in continuing the questioning of Aristotle and Ptolemy that had begun with Al-Biruni and Al-Hatham. As an example, we know of one work titled Recapitulation Regarding Ptolemy that listed a variety of objections to the Alexandrians' work, especially that in the Almagest. And they were posed perhaps as a series of research questions, but unfortunately, the work is lost to us now. This book, though, can be thought of as part of a larger movement known as the Andalusian Revolt. In this, a number of astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers took up the challenge laid down by Al-Hatham to do and embrace skepticism and undertake more systematic investigations of the received wisdom of the past. No longer was it thought that just because Aristotle or Ptolemy made some claim, that was enough to establish the claim's veracity. An important figure in this movement was a man by the name of Ar-Zakali, or Arzakal as his Western name goes. Ar-Zakali is the first person to create what is known as a Safiya, or a sort of universal astrolabe that could be adjusted to be used at any latitude, unlike the earlier versions that were only valid at one distance north of the equator. More importantly, Ar-Zakali was able to establish through direct measurement that the orbit of Mercury could not be circular, and suggested instead that it was oval-shaped. This is a discovery of monumental importance, in that it was a clear evidence that Aristotle's assertion that all celestial motion must be circular had to be in error. While a number of writers have suggested that in making this measurement, Ar-Zakali is anticipating Johannes Kepler's determination of elliptical orbits by some 600 years, it should be understood that the Andalusian astronomer was still working from within a geocentric model, and, as we'll discover in due time, his motivation for such an orbit was observational, unlike Kepler's more physical force-motivated explanations. Still, the influence of Al-Zakali's work can be seen in that he is the other Islamic astronomer referenced by Copernicus in the revolutions of the spheres. Another figure of some interest is the astronomer Ibn Bajjah, who said that the Milky Way was not a diffuse band of light created by some continuous distribution of matter or material, but rather an untold number of small individual stars whose light is made more diffuse by the refraction and dispersal caused by the Earth's atmosphere. Of course, this explanation would be proved to correct by the telescopic observations of Galileo and others in the 17th century. In the city of Toledo, a group of astronomers is said to have created a new set of star tables based on measurements made at that city in around 1060 CE. These tables were the most accurate produced at that time, and they would be eventually referenced by Chaucer in the Franklin's Tale. As important as the work of each of these figures was, the true significance of the Andalusian Golden Age is what it meant for the transmission of Islamic science into Europe, as the former territories of the fallen Western Roman Empire struggled to emerge from the period of political instability and intellectual stagnation that set in as the waves of migration and conquest washed across Germania, Gaul, Britannia, and Italy. While there are a number of channels through which this work and thinking of the classical age returned to Europe, none was so important as the contact European scholars had with the courts of the Umayyads and their successors and the scholars associated with them. Perhaps the most important figure in this is Ibn Rushd, otherwise known as Averroes. It was primarily through his work of translating Aristotle from Arabic into Latin and commentating on that work that many of those associated with the growing scholastic movement in Europe would first encounter the physics and cosmology that had been understood and assimilated in the Islamic world for 3 centuries. Unfortunately, as is often the case historically, this will all come crashing down. In the East, the Abbasids will become increasingly irrelevant as breakaway caliphates will assume greater and greater power. When the Mongols arrive in the 13th century, they will annihilate most of the great cities of Persia and Arabia, and the accumulations of wisdom and knowledge will be lost. In the West, as we have said, similar forces will conspire to bring an end to the Andalusian Caliphate, though some centers of scholarship will continue to exist beyond the changes in political structure. Before we conclude, though, there is one additional figure I would be remiss if I didn't mention. During the period of Mongol conquest of Persia and Arabia, there is an astronomer who was able to escape the fate suffered by so many figures, a man by the name of Althusser. When his city was captured, he managed to convince Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, to hire him on as a talented advisor. In this role, he was allowed to construct an observatory, gather other scholars around him, and continue his work in his place called Margra, east of Tehran. Beginning in 1259 CE, this group set out to compile the greatest set of astronomical tables ever produced, a goal they by and large achieved. Under Althusser, Marga kept alive the tradition of Islamic science for a few more decades after the Mongol conquest, producing new work in fields of astronomy, mathematics, geography, history, and philosophy. Althusser's most important work in the field of astronomy was titled Memoir on Astronomy, and in it he proposes a fundamental reworking of the cosmology of Ptolemy. By many accounts, this work is the most important piece of astronomical research done in the field in medieval times. In it, Althusser puts forward a model of the universe that does away with Ptolemy's equant and eccentric by replacing them with a smaller circle revolving around the inner rim of a larger circle that was twice its diameter. This inner circle would oscillate back and forth in a linear fashion along the larger diameter circle. This new model was able to restore the idea of uniform circular motion of celestial objects and return the Earth to the center of the cosmos, both being solutions favored by natural philosophers who held Aristotle's physics to be correct and necessary to a proper description of the universe. This method would be used to its greatest effect by another astronomer, Ibn al-Shatir, who would be able to produce theories of solar and lunar motion that far exceeded in terms of precision those of Ptolemy. As we will see, these models will be very important when Copernicus is looking for a way to fix the Ptolemaic model's deficiencies in the middle of the 16th century. However, before we get to that place, we need to take a survey of the situation in Europe from the 9th century forward to better understand what Copernicus and his contemporaries will be working with. As I close this episode, there are a couple of bits of housekeeping I need to attend to. First, I've been asked by the good folks over at the Science Media Awards to submit the podcast for consideration in their 2016 awards. While I'm sure that there are a number of shows that are more deserving of any award they might give, I'm honored to be asked. As part of the submission process, they'd like me to send 3 shows for review, and that's where you come in. Over at our Facebook page, I've pinned a post to the top of the page asking for your suggestions as to the top 3 episodes for the show. We've got until sometime around the end of May 2016 to get the stuff in, so I'd like to have you guys weigh in before that date. I'd really appreciate it if you could give me some feedback. Second, for those who are able, please post a review for the podcast however you are able to. While I know that Android users are having a tough time with this based on what player you're using, I'd sure be appreciative for anything that you can do. Even if it's just leaving comments on individual episodes or for the podcast as a whole, every little bit helps us get the word out. I know the last thing you want to do is stop in the middle of whatever you're doing or listening to, but if you've got a few minutes of downtime before dinner, say, or when you're about to go to bed or whatever, try to leave us a note. Third, spread the word and invite more people to join the crew. Let folks know by sharing our Facebook posts and retweeting our episode links. By the way, if you're on Twitter, you can find us there by searching on #ScientificOdyssey, all one word. I try to share a link to a past episode each day. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Chad Davies, all one word. Finally, I've been plugging away on this podcast by producing regular weekly episodes for about 4 months now. I am, however, coming up on finals week in my day job, and then the short but ever so necessary break between the spring and summer semesters. While I expect to be able to continue to produce weekly episodes through the end of April, I will likely take a bit of a break in early May to get ahead on some research and just to recharge a bit. I'll let you know when that's going to happen and suggest some other resources you can access to help meet your podcast needs. In our next episode, we'll take a look at the life of Al-Hatham in much greater detail to talk about his work in light, optics, mathematics, and astronomy. So until then, full sails on your journey.